Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Windows Insider and MVP Program podcast for IT Pro X. Today's podcast special will be in English. Although I had to disappoint Derek a lot, he really wanted to brush off his Norwegian skills. But for the sake of the technical depth, we would like to have him in his own mother language in English. So, hello, Derek.
That. Hello. How's it going, Alex?
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. We're finally rid of some snow. What about you?
I'm doing pretty good. Bright and sunny here. You see me rocking my Hawaiian.
Well, that's good. So, Derek, tell us what you're working on.
Sure. So I am a program manager. I work in the enterprise and security space. As a whole, I basically work on a feature called memory integrity, and it's part of the broader umbrella of virtualization-based security. So we take, I can give a quick high-level overview of what virtualization-based security is right now. Essentially, we use the Windows hypervisor to create an isolated region of memory, similar to if you're creating a virtual machine. But we use this virtual region of memory to run security features, and it becomes one of the main roots of trust of the entire operating system. So my feature memory integrity, we run something called code integrity from within this secure kernel or isolated region of memory. And we're responsible for building new additions to this to these protections and getting security features in general deployed broadly across Windows and other Microsoft products.
So you mentioned Windows, but Windows runs on something. Does it matter what kind of devices you use?
In general, so VBS has some dependency on hardware, but in general, no. In general, you can run VBS on virtually any Windows device that's out there. It's also supported for other platforms such as server. That being said, there have been improvements made over the years to performance with the hypervisor. That makes it so devices coming out now start to have the feature enabled by default.
So the reason why we haven't seen this turned on is because of the taxation of performance?
That's one of the main reasons, yeah. As with some security features, it comes with new compliance requirements, and a lot of the Windows desktop space isn't quite up to par with some of the compliance requirements we had. So we've also been on a long journey of getting applications out, getting the applications in the Windows ecosystem compliant with, run together and be able to run an entire set of Windows apps that people love while still being secure. So it's been those two journeys together, performance and compatibility.
Yeah, so it's a typical two-way street where you don't want to trade off productivity and features for security. Meanwhile, you still want the security, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So where did this idea sprung out of? Was it like one of you guys woke up one day and said, "Hey, what about we use Hyper-V to make some virtual code memory integrity and just protect everything"? Where did this spring out of?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it came down to there was a big rise at some point in what's called kernel escalation of privilege attacks. So more and more attackers out in the wild were attacking the Windows kernel, and they got by a lot of the protections that we already had in place. And the reason you attack the kernel is because once you execution the kernel, you essentially have full admin privileges. So we went on a mission to harden the Windows kernel and be resilient against these kind of attacks. And one of the best ways to do this, it came out, was we created, I told you, I just said, when you get kernel execution, you're now an admin. We essentially created a whole new level of trust that went beyond the kernel. And this was where virtualization-based security was born. So we created this new region of computing space and memory that became the most privileged space on the operating system. And that, just by doing that, it broke a lot of existing malware attacks that were out there.
So it had actually previous and legacy attackers to kind of thank for the result of the memory code integrity. So
yeah, our team is constantly responding to the threat landscape, which is also the threat landscape is constantly evolving, so we have to evolve with it.
Well, that's a good idea. And we've seen that virtualization-based security works in a sort of way of levels and layers where you have multiple levels of protection. And one of those are credential guard. So what kind of protection does credential guard give in this? Because if they get access to your credential, does it really matter to protect the kernel at all?
That's a great question. And yeah, credential compromise, there's lots of different pathways for compromise. So we've built a bunch of VBS features to try to mitigate against each of them. Credential guard is one where in, I'll say typical legacy old Windows without VBS, your credentials are stored in a certain location. And with credential guard, what we end up doing is taking that location and storing them within the secure region of memory. So it makes it more difficult for an attacker to actually compromise them. But at some level, yeah, you're right. Because if a attacker does get access to your credentials, it doesn't matter if your kernel is hardened because your kernel will accept the credentials that they stole.
So there are levels and layers. And what kind of hyper virtualization-based security feature within the Hyper-V platform or Windows as a product do you really find that this is super awesome and I need to tell everyone about it?
Yeah, I'm biased in this answer, but it's called memory integrity. That's the branding on the settings application. If you go into security settings, we like to call it hypervisor protected code integrity. It's essentially, in my opinion, one of the best protections that VBS can provide that hardens the kernel the most is we're running code integrity. So it's run all the time on your standard Windows devices. It protects your kernel. But now, like I said before, attackers attack it all the time and found ways around it. So we've started running code integrity within this VBS container and providing a few other like lockdowns of the lockdowns on the restrictions that mincing my words. We provided we've eliminated a whole threat of don't worry, I'll get the word here. We've eliminated a category of attack, which is essentially we prevent dynamic code generation in the kernel. So that was an approach that essentially what attackers could do is if they get some memory that is writable and executable in the kernel, they write their malicious code to this memory page and then they go execute it later. So we, as a security team, would have no idea what's being executed. With HPCI memory integrity, what we've done is we've eliminated that possibility. We've said in the kernel, there's absolutely nowhere that you can have writable and executable code. You're not allowed to have any dynamic code generation. And since we are code integrity, we're able to authorize exactly what is being loaded into the kernel, an overseer of everything that's going on in the Windows kernel, and we're able to regulate it effectively.
It kind of makes my mind hurt when I try to picture what you're doing. I see memory chips and I see entire cells and blocks trying to be manipulated, and the only thing I end up with is my mind being manipulated. So on that, you mentioned that this is a feature you turn on in the security settings in Windows. Is there any benefit of having this turned on from factory versus post installation applying this feature?
In short, yes. Yes and no. So we'd love in the security space to be able to make security promises and say from day one of this device, we know exactly, we have a set of things that we can make promises for because we know exactly what has happened on this device. When you turn on security features later in basically a device's lifetime, you can't make those same exact set of promises, but at the end of the day, a lot of the protections that are provided are the same. So we can't know if someone installed something and tampered with your device ahead of time, but it's a fairly niche attack, and for the vast majority of users, turning on this feature and these protections, I'll say a year into owning your device, is just as good as getting it out of the factory. But most people don't do that, so we're really making a push to get this enabled out of the factory and have everyone protected by default without them having to worry about it.
So for those who haven't turned this on, is there a management way that's easy to do that on thousands of devices in your organization?
There definitely is management controls for this. You can apply it through a code integrity policy or some of the typical management CSPs. And yeah, so that's actually one of the biggest ways that we're enabled today, is that enterprises will enable it on all of the devices in their company.
So you mentioned a lot of things that's commonplace and things that are fun and joy to talk about now. Not the boring stuff like Minesweeper and browsers, right? We all love to do the memory integrity show in Windows, but what's the next big cool thing that we should be looking out for in Windows virtualization security that you can talk about?
That's a great question. So have you heard of something called Secured Core? It's a branding that we're putting on these new line of devices that have basically all of our hottest new VBS features enabled by default, with the big one that we haven't talked about yet being something called firmware protection. That's what it's called in the settings app. So if you go into settings, your device security settings, and you see a toggle for firmware protection, toggle that on. That one is actually very hardware specific and is only on the latest new hardware. So most of your listeners might not see it if they go into that app. But what that is really trying to do is ensure, so HVCI, memory integrity, protects you from the moment the OS starts to boot. And we rely heavily on something called secure boot to ensure that chain of trust of boot is ensured. Firmware protection really takes next steps to ensure that the firmware code that's executing isn't tampered with either.
So this is something that you launched about a year and a half ago, the Secure Core PC. You had a couple of vendors where you had this launch together with. And if I'm not profoundly mistaken, this is something that you already done in the gaming industry of the Xbox series.
Yeah, you're definitely right there. And Xbox was easier since we've controlled the end-to-end and all the apps that run on it. But yeah, they're basically taking a Xbox security feature and adapting it for desktop.
So going from firmware to secure boot to memory integrity, credential guard, and then you have the most scary thing of all running on your PC, and that's the browser, right?
Yes. Yeah. Browsing is where people can fall into traps.
Yeah. So you have stuff that protects you from there on, but that might be a talk for a different day. But those products do exist within Windows, right?
Yeah. And we call it Windows Defender Application Guard, and I can give a quick overview of what it is. So we've talked about creating VBS, creating an isolated space of memory that is protected from the rest of the world, and we run our security features in there. And that's because we are trying to protect the operation of the security feature from everything else that's going on in the OS. Now, with Windows Defender Application Guard, we're kind of flipping that a little bit, and now we're spinning up a new container with the hypervisor, and we're running the scary, untrusted browser within that container. So then we running day-to-day in the operating system are protected from whatever might be happening in the browser. So if you click on a bad link that immediately will install some malware, that malware will maybe run, but it's going to run inside of a container that can't touch you. And then if you do end up downloading files, it gets downloaded as untrusted files. And you're perfectly able to go in and copy and paste those over to where you want to actually use them. But we call it out like, hey, you really should double check before you run this file.
Yeah, and there you have a great different security features. Some call it development tool. I call it security tool, and that's the Windows Sandbox. So you can take those download the files, copy them into the sandbox, and make it implode.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. I can't. I don't have too much to comment on for the sandbox. It's a wonderful tool, but I don't play with it, or I don't personally build too much with it.
Yeah. So if there's anything we could do to try out these features, so of course, there's probably less you would like to do than recommend people to try to hack their firmware. But if we want to try out and see that credential guard is working and see how it's running on your device and to see that, hey, it's actually turned on, is there any tools, guides, services, anything we can look for and say, hey, we have this feature enabled, we are protected?
So a few places you can look. The first one that pops into my head is something called MS Info 32. If you type that into your Windows search bar, it pops up a list of all of these features you have enabled. Down at the bottom, like there's a couple of lines that say virtualization-based security features and protections and what's configured and running. And you might see a list there. Like currently, if I go to that, it says credential guards running. I have HVCI running, VBS is running. But that would be the most immediate place. I agree. I am not going to recommend that you download any malware to test out whether credential guard is working. We've done it. There's definitely things out there that you can test with, but I won't provide the pointer here.
Probably safe to do that. This goes under the section, do not try this at home.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So is there anything else you would like to share with us tonight?
I don't have any main points to hit. Just other than that, like if you're curious about these features, highly recommend going into your device settings app. If you type in core isolation in the taskbar, it'll pop up a settings page, and core isolation is our term for virtualization-based security. So everything that we are developing for VBS will pop up there, and if it's possible on your computer, you can hit the toggle and it'll turn it on.
I need to say that I'm so sorry because I just did that and memory integrity is not enabled. So
yes.
I just did a screenshot of that and I will turn that on. So if something happens and I'm leaving this call, we know why.
Yeah. And actually, one other point that I can have there, I mentioned at the beginning about compatibility. So if you do hit that toggle, you don't need to do it now. A scan will run on your device. And what it's essentially doing is checking to see if you previously installed any software that wouldn't work with memory integrity on. So if we detect that anything you have installed isn't going to work with memory integrity, we take a step back and say, hey, sorry, we're not going to turn on the feature. Technically, there are ways around that. If you're enterprise management, you want to force it on, but then if you do that, the app might stop working. So just calling that out as that's a possible thing. That's by design. We're saying it's okay. We value your apps working that you like.
Is that typical applications and software, Win32 applications, or is that typical drivers? Because I've seen some headsets, especially the Jabra headset that I'm running, have caught me some issues in previous years.
Yeah, good call out. It's the drivers is really what it is. So it could be a Win32 application, but it's really the drivers that the application brings along with it. And they're all kernel mode drivers that might be doing, they might be doing something funky, or realistically 90% of the failures out there are just old drivers that haven't checked a few boxes and are, and I'll say they're HLK signing, which is, so basically one of my missions is to go reach out to all of these drivers that are failing this check. So every time, if you do encounter an issue, I recommend submitting it through Feedback Hub and also reaching out to the driver manufacturer, just sending them a ping saying, hey, you're blocking me from turning on a security feature. It makes my job a lot easier. Well,
I will make your job a lot easier tonight.
Thank you.
So on that, go out and try out and enable the features that we've been talking about, the credential guard, the memory integrity. Try those out. And on that, thank you so much for sharing those insights with us, Derek. It's been super helpful and super interesting.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, so bye.
Bye.